Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 4 with Black Ice. Alright, well, as you can see, our don't know if they're allies or what, but the Japanese faction here is doing quite well. Sorry, I'm putting in a cough lozenge to keep me from coughing during this episode, so it may mean I'm slurring a word or two more than I'd like. And our sort of friends, enemies, the Chinese, we're at war with them in a sub-war. No, not a submarine war, but a minor war. Because they're allied with the Dutch, and we fought the Dutch, so, otherwise they're not. Alright, well, they are sort of our friends in that they're messing heavily with the Soviets and keeping them a bit more docile. But they're not doing so well against the Japanese now, so... Well, they may be able to hold that border, I don't know. We will see. Maybe the Japanese will go to war with the Soviets after they get China done, but of course they're also at war with the US. And brought them into war. Excuse me. With us somewhat, but I've also shifted a lot of my air power up over here from Italy that we had been earlier fighting. There was a lot of air power based in Malta. We need to have air superiority if we're going to be able to do paratroop. Okay, great. As you can see, build cost down on a lot of unit types. So we've got air superiority over the channel now. And near parity over southern England.
Bereit! Bereit zum Ausrücken! Bereit zum Ausrücken! Bereit! Bereit zum Ausrücken!
Okay, let's cancel this division, yeah. We're just getting, I'm a little uncomfortable with. These are really small. The overseas garrisons. Yeah, a little bit.
Bereit! Befehle! Angetreten! Ausrücken!
He's got
Weiter,
hold on now.
weiter!
Well, 2 more divisions on the way there. See, these help because they reduce the cost of production. These increase the production lines. I'm not gotten good with the balance of what we need, or what's the best balance on some of these. See, uniform factory. Well, we haven't built one of those in a long time, so we'll build one. And honestly, it's just mostly my ignorance. I just don't know what the right ratio, as it were, would be.
Befehle? Bereit!
Well, good. Yeah, getting rid of
Bereit!
creating a true pocket would be good.
Befehle?
Oh, good. We got
Zuhören.
Durban. Oh, Port Elizabeth. Okay, sorry, I don't know why. So I'm having geography.
Angetreten!
Too wrong.
Befehle? Ausrücken!
Oh, okay. Well, now that they've... Excuse me. This cough I have is just lingering. I'm not really feeling sick or feeling bad, but it's just
Angetreten! Ihre Befehle?
sort of lingering for a while here.
Bereit zum Ausrücken! Ausrücken!
Good, improved anti-aircraft, that's nice. Okay, so artillery is fairly well done. This wasn't a very common gun in my opinion. German, I'm not a German artillery expert, but do have a few books on it and read. This 100 or 210 millimeter mortar. Don't think it looked anything like that, but not sure. What was common that did look sort of like that was the 170 millimeter. That was sort of the standard heavy artillery piece for the German, most divisions. You're starting to get more into specialty artillery units that were designed to reach the Maginot Line and later used for some of the siege warfare against like fortifications in the Crimea or against some of the cities. But they did use the 210 millimeter gun, but mostly it was just the 170. Now I know the 170 is only a 20 millimeters bigger than the 150, so it might not sound significantly more, but it's more powder behind the round, so it has excuse me again, has much longer range. So a battery of guns in one position can affect a greater area of the battlefield without having to move them, and even just at that scale, 20 millimeters more in diameter of powder charges and such, really make the impact of the round considerably more in sort of two aspects. One, if you're looking for a direct impact on like a bunker, a hardened position, could be a concrete thing, but could also just be wood, sandbags, and some rocks and earth kind of stuff all built up around. Either way, you have a much more damage on something like that. But also when you're looking at airburst type rounds, they'll affect the bigger area, so you can miss a little more. Of course, they didn't have GPS and precise aiming that we have nowadays, so artillery of all these types, indirect, are all area effect weapons. So if you have something that has a bigger blast area, you can have more rounds missing directly the target, but still getting into greater blast effects. So that was sort of the standard German. So this to me is, I really haven't looked. I know we use some, but it's not something that I want to pursue because I'm not looking for large immobile city assault weapons. Now this is okay. We're doing that. Yeah, I want to do the desert units because we're still messing around and fighting in the desert here and such. But getting something like the radios, I think, will help more units affect the game more. Is the way I sort of look at that.
Angetreten. Ihre Befehle.
Okay. Yep, we're just going to build even more transports. Portugal. I'm going to... That's for controls of states. Let's see. Great. That's really great because that will give us... Look at all those factories. Look at all those factories. And look at those. That just... well, obviously we have a lot more things being produced now, like uniforms that are done in military factories, and yeah, I would say South Africa was producing its own uniforms, not importing them, but South Africa had very, very little arms production in it, and that was primarily due to the British, in that South Africa was still very much looked at a rebellious province. Someday Tanganyika will explore South Africa even more. Obviously, they've done fair work, in my opinion, doing some of the fascist elements for Together for Victory on it. I think they've sort of targeted some of the wrong political groups, titles and leaders, but there's still the Afrikaans ethnic group there that was rather anti-British. I mean, they're still to this day, there's strong memories of the concentration camps, and concentration camps I know are and they rightly so have a very bad name. But I saw somebody using the term concentration camps in a recent misspeaking by the U.S. spokesman and such, when really what they should have been referring to was death camps. Because you got to remember, concentration camps, I think, were started by the British, and I think the term was first used by the British. And the way the British used them was pretty ugly, actually. And it was, and the reason I'm bringing this up here is it was in South Africa, is that commando is a South African term, and it's sort of like going commando, which means something different today, I know, than Dan did, but it's sort of going out and leaving your sort of farm or your ranch and doing guerrilla warfare kind of viewpoint. And so the men of military age would go out and take their rifle and their ammunition and their horse and go fight the British. After a while, realizing that to some degree their logistic support, maybe not for ammunition and definitely not for things like weapons, but their food, remounts horses, clothing, leather cartridge belts could be made locally and all that kind of stuff, was the popular support. So Britain started rounding up the Afrikaans people, white people, and putting them in concentration camps, and in essence putting them on slow starvation. It was pretty ugly. A lot of people died. Some of it might be just poor sanitary conditions, that they just didn't have the ability to set up, running water toilets or whatever, in these bad locations, and got a large group of people. So once sickness broke out, it went, viral, literally, through the camps, and people got sick and died. So some of that might be that, but enough of it was just poor diets that the English were quite capable of, maybe not in any 1 week period, but over time quite capable of providing enough food for these people that they've taken the responsibility of moving off their land and putting in camps. Very different when Britain very successfully in the Malaya emergency, not so much concentration camps, but sort of enforced fortified villages, that they would go into an area where the communists were operating, round up all of the people, put them in, maybe take them from 2 or 3 villages, put them all into one village, put a fence around that village, generally eventually get a local militia guarding that village, and letting the people out during the day to go farm in their fields, but you must be back at night in your village. Oh, and you can't take food or anything like that out of your village during the day for the guerrillas, for the guerrillas to support them. So they were sort of, locked up at night in these, armed camps that are sort of local villages, but more condensed, to separate the people from the guerrillas in the Malaya campaign. The U.S. tried something like that for a while in Vietnam. It worked reasonably well, but Vietnam was a much, much more populous country, obviously many more borders, and much harder to do it where you could, limit the access to Malaya a little bit easier. So the British were able to do a much, much more humane, if you will, enforced concentration of people in just a few villages. They weren't mass camps or anything like that. The U.S., of course, used concentration camps very heavily. The millions of people, maybe hundreds of thousands, definitely people, during World War II, and that's done under the Democrats. So whenever you start hearing people praise FDR and how great he wasn't that great on freedom. They had lots of concentration camps in the U.S. These aren't prisoners of war camps. These are concentration camps. Some of them were in the East Coast, made up of mainly Italian and Japanese nationals that had immigrated to the U.S. but had yet to get citizenship. And that, I think, is a reasonable thing, because any Americans living in Germany, once the war started between Germany and the U.S., basically were also locked up. And again, any Germans living in Britain when the war started were locked up. You lock up foreigners of enemy nations. That's a reasonable thing. The United States gets a little different in that the U.S. had actively encouraged migration from Italy, from Germany, so we had large populations of people that were still of other nations, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of pressure of becoming a citizen. There was some, but a lot of people moved here, and their children were going to be citizens of the U.S. and everything, but they just remained citizens of their country, and were going to spend the rest of their lives living in the U.S. and being somewhat American. They got locked up. What really gets bad is locking up U.S. nationals of Japanese descent. Again, that's different than taking they should. There were a lot of Japanese, not Japanese Americans, but Japanese, again, of Japanese nationality, living in places, particularly Hawaii, that should be locked up. Now, condition becomes really important. You know, locking somebody up in the middle of the war who happens to be a Japanese national, to me, is a reasonable thing. Again, there were a lot of them in Hawaii. What becomes unreasonable is that they start locking up U.S. citizens that are of Japanese descent. That's where you start going over the line, with the criteria just being they're Japanese, of Japanese descent. Not that they had done anything wrong or belonged to any wrong groups or anything like that. A lot of the ones on the, particularly it was California, though I'm sure that there were some in Hawaii and Oregon, they were rounded up. A lot of their property was confiscated if they didn't sell it. A lot of them were sort of forced to sell at very low prices. They were moved out into this part of California, not like the Central Valley. I want to say Manzanar, maybe one of the camps. A famous Japanese American who I don't agree with very much, though I met a couple of times many years ago, is George Takei of Star Trek fame. He, as a very young boy, grew up, I think maybe a little bit more west, but in a U.S. concentration camp for Japanese Americans, and remembers it as a child. So we put these people away. We took their land. They weren't given their land back after the war. A lot of them were farmers. That's why it's land and not just a house or an apartment or something. It was, considerable multi-generational property that they lost. Now, once you get to particularly like 43 and beyond, a lot of the people, if they wanted to move to this part of the United States, a lot of the Japanese citizens were allowed out of the camps. Now they would have to, register where they're going and get all kinds of permissions that a regular U.S. citizen wouldn't. And these are U.S. citizens, again, not Japanese nationals, would be allowed to be away because they were thought to be out of any danger zone of, for sabotage or invasion, and a little bit out of the danger zone. And there is a little bit of for their protection, but that's maybe 5 or 10% of the issue, not the major reason of the issue. So the U.S. definitely used concentration camps, and like I say, just parts of California, they're not nice. This is desert out here, people. It's not that kind of desert. If you look at U.S. province pictures for the Hearts of Iron 3 mod that I made, that very few people ever did, that basically adds California provinces, you can see photos of the different regions in which they were. But these are god-awfully hot regions in summer and god-awfully cold regions in winter. They're not pleasant at all where they were moved to. So, but conditions over time were worked to be improved. I mean, again, it doesn't make it all right that they're treated well. That you take citizens without their permission, and that haven't done anything wrong, haven't belonged to a bad group, aren't being any suspicion of being spies or anything like that. We're not talking about they had any reason other than that they were just Japanese citizens. There were, for the Italian Americans and the German Americans, especially the German Americans, you sort of had to be members of like the, at least my understanding, and I don't know it as well because I'm a Californian, so I know the story out here very well, actually. I don't know the story on the East Coast as well. I watched a few documentaries or whatever and did some study on it, but it's not, trust me, the U.S. government, generally speaking, through the school system, through its thing, does not want to mention this. It's not that it's hidden or forbidden, it's just you don't bring it, it's just not brought up and stuff. It's sort of thought of to be irrelevant at the time. And but mostly what I understand is along the East Coast, you had to be like the German American Bund member, or other sorts of suspicious group, for if you're a German American citizen, for you to be locked up. You had to do that. And like the head of the German American Bund, I forget his name, Kuhn, Fritz Kuhn, I think maybe, spent the whole war locked up, and these types of people were definitely locked up. And there's a reason for it. Fritz Kuhn was obviously a foreign enemy agent. Was he going to go out and plant a bomb? Probably not. Would he have shut up during the war? Probably. But he was a foreign enemy agent, and there's every reason to lock him up once the war starts. So that's sort of the history of concentration camps in America and Britain, sort of at the time. So, but these really affected the South Africans, made the South Africans
Ihre Befehle.
never really like the English because of that. And there's real legitimacy to the, more so than the, and there was a fascist movement in Australia, but the likelihood of it ever gaining power is infinitesimal, to the point that it's, in my opinion, ludicrous fantasy that, they have the fascist path for Australia or something. Fine, they wanted to make alt history so that if you want to go down these paths, you could, for sandbox reasons and whatnot. I don't object if a player wants to play that way. I just object that they take so much time putting it into the core of the game when there's so much other work they could do. But in South Africa, very much, I agree with their, to an extent. I mean, it's more minor quibbles, shall we say. But the idea that South Africa could go fascist, because you have, again, the sort of Transvaal. The party that eventually takes over South Africa is the party, I mean, completely for the apartheid period, is basically, to some degree, the localized version of the Nazi party for South Africa. It's just a question of whether and they weren't really National Socialists, so they weren't the Nazi party. And you know what I mean by the National Socialists, because I've talked a lot about Germany. But they were a racist, anti-English, semi-fascistic type party. And I say semi-fascistic, that they're probably a bit more free market than fascist and other things like that. But their sort of right-wing party is what eventually takes over South Africa anyways. So that there's that, and then particularly in Southwest Africa, but also in South Africa, because this is up here is Southwest Africa, and over here is South Africa. There are definitely Nazi party, with swastika flags, rallies going on in South Africa too, which is different than the local versions. And then sort of the extreme, and then there are a lot of the sort of local Bund type members over here in Southwest Africa that are of German descent. These were more Dutch descent than German, I think, mostly. So that there's a lot of support behind that going anti-English. So England, getting back to where I started from, I know I do this a lot, but England didn't have large arms production in this area because it did not trust its population. It had one of its major colonial arms production. God, I really don't know. I want to say over here, but I don't know. In Ishapur, India, I actually own a couple of Ishapur rifles. In Ishapur Arsenal, which still exists to this day, I think they've long stopped making the Enfield. They made lots of FNFAL type or L1A1 type rifles, and Bren guns and similar sorts of things. They later switched to Bren guns. They started out as the Vickers light machine gun, which is just a Raj weapon, not one that was used in the British Army. Looks like a Bren gun, generally. The Vickers design does. But they had a much more significant arms production in India. They had the, I think Lithgow is on the west coast. Maybe I got that wrong, sorry, Australians. But the Lithgow arms arsenal was going strong. Now it's getting much more small arms these days, Enfields and those types of rifles. Much more arms production there in Australia. than this. This is just... I just can't imagine them having all this type of stuff. So a few maybe, but this is just way out of proportion strong. Just so you know, feedback. Because basically every significant bit of arms, and that means pistols, rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, tanks, aircraft, whatever, were imported to South Africa for the World War II. Post World War II and gearing up towards the sort of isolation and apartheid period, that's when arms corps starts and South Africa really starts to become an arms producing nation, which it still is today. Oh, we need to, since we've just acquired all this territory, we've got a bunch more factories. Yay. Okay, one thing I want to do some, well, let's see, what more do we have here? Okay, better artillery. So let's close that. Let's look for our artillery and see if we can. No, okay, it's the 105. Okay, so we want to upgrade the 105mm guns. What is our propellant charge? Okay, well, let's do that. I just want to close that first to make sure that we're upgrading the right thing. I'm going to ignore the AA protection. So now they're a little better than standard model. And now we'll upgrade to the so that will help most assuredly. Another thing that I want to do, okay, this is still over here, is I've also, to some of the armored divisions, I've added one mechanized infantry battalion. But I need a bunch more half-tracks, so we're going to start those producing. Actually, reduce the number of those. Production. This is the outdated model, I know. Because I think we have enough stock for those as well. There we go. Okay, well, we're going to end the episode here. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for liking the video. And of course, love hearing from you, so please post questions, comments, suggestions, ideas. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.